Well, good morning, everybody. Pastor Steve here. Thank you so much for being with me. We are continuing our reading of Mark's Gospel. This morning we're in chapter 15, and it continues what we were reading yesterday, Jesus being on trial and crucified and so on. And my devotional thought today is similar to yesterday. As I'm just drawn in this chapter, especially I think this time, maybe more than some other times I've read these two chapters, to the suffering of Jesus. And I want to kind of couch my thoughts around a few different things. One is the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, Sadducees, the scribes, the elders, the religious leaders of Judaism at this moment in time that offered Jesus to Pilate for crucifixion. Just their hypocrisy. When you read all four Gospels, it becomes clear there were many reasons, many different issues or things that motivated them in their reaction to Christ. I mean, many of them genuinely did not believe him and thought he was a false prophet, thought he was guilty of blasphemy, claiming to be God, and he wasn't in their eyes. It's also true that another factor was many of them were just jealous of Jesus. They were envious. That comes out in this chapter. Pilate knew they were envious of his popularity with the people, and how the people admired Jesus, but did not always admire them. But another factor that sometimes gets overlooked is the Pharisees had kind of a divided opinion about the Romans. They all hated the Romans. They all hated the fact that Rome ruled Judea and Jerusalem. They wanted freedom. And there were a few of them who were kind of militant in their opposition to Rome, but the majority of them were more practical. And they sought sort of a conciliatory tone toward the Roman leaders, because they didn't want there to be so much rebellion and insurrection that it resulted in Rome's army destroying the country, destroying the city, destroying them and their positions of prestige and so on. And, eventually that did happen with the revolt that happened in the 60s AD and Titus and the army destroying Jerusalem in AD 67. So they were concerned about that. And so when they presented Jesus to Pilate for crucifixion, they had to have something that would get Pilate's attention and cause him to want to crucify Christ. And so they accused Jesus of insurrection. He's claiming to be king of the Jews. That's rebellion. But the hypocrisy is this. Starting in verse 6, it's the custom for Pilate on Passover and the unleavened bread, those feasts, they go together, to release a prisoner, sign of good faith. It was a PR move on the part of the Romans. And in prison was Barabbas, a man who had actually participated in a real insurrection, a real rebellion, and in doing so had committed murder. So he's in prison, probably facing execution at some point. I don't know, but anyway. And Pilate offers, who do you want, Jesus or Barabbas? And the religious leaders rile up the crowd to ask for Barabbas to be set free and Jesus to be crucified. Now, how they did that, we don't know all the details, but it's what they did. It's the end result. And here's the hypocrisy. They were so concerned about insurrection and Rome possibly destroying them that a guy who would actually try to foment insurrection, Barabbas, they wanted him to go free. And Jesus, who had done nothing to encourage insurrection or rebellion against the Romans, wanted him crucified. And that's their hypocrisy, the inconsistency. And here's the thing. Hypocrisy will cause people to say and do almost anything to protect themselves or get their way or make themselves look good. And part of the suffering of Jesus was the hypocrisy that he encountered, but also the suffering he endured from the Roman soldiers. in verse 16. The soldiers took Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium. It's kind of like an inner courtyard. And they called together the whole Roman cohort. But that's a large number of soldiers. And they dressed him up in purple. Why purple? That's the color of royalty. He's king of the Jews. We're going to make fun of him. Put a purple robe on, a royal color. And after twisting a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And those thorns were about, a couple inches long. They weren't little short thorns. Verse 18, and they began to acclaim him, "Hail, King of the Jews." They're mocking him, making fun of him. They kept beating his head with a reed, a rod, because kings carry a scepter, a rod, and give Jesus a stick, making fun of, and then hit him over the head, pushing those thorns into his scalp. And then they would bow before him like he bowed before a king or a queen. They were mocking Jesus as they physically abused Jesus. And it says in verse 20, they mocked him. Mark doesn't tell us about the scourging, but the other Gospels tell us that Jesus was scourged before they put the purple robe on. That means beaten with a whip. There was also the suffering that Jesus endured just from the attitudes and actions of the people. They'd already said, "Crucify him." I wonder how many of those who cried out, "Crucify him," were in the crowds when a week before they sang out, "Hosanna," as he rode the donkey into Jerusalem. But in verse 29, as Jesus is hanging on the cross, and I didn't even mention the suffering of having the nails driven through his wrist and feet. Verse 29, those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads. And I try to picture that, hurling abuse. It's like just throwing something. Someone hurls vomit a kid when they're sick. I'm just hurling this abuse at Jesus and wagging their heads. Can't you just picture that? And even the chief priest, verse 31. In the same way, the chief priest also, along with the scribes, were mocking him. You would think people who have a true heart for God, religious people, would have a little bit of compassion. They didn't. They mocked Jesus. And then the two thieves crucified with him. Now we know that eventually one of them turned to Jesus and asked for Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom, he was saved. But that's not how it started. In verse 32, at the end of the verse, it says, those who were crucified with him were also mocking or insulting him. I mean, they're dying, but what are they doing? They're making fun of Jesus. There was so much physical pain in the suffering of Jesus. But there was a lot of emotional pain, trauma, emotional abuse. And that's to say nothing of the spiritual suffering Jesus encountered, because we're told in this chapter that in the middle of his 6 or so hours hanging on the cross, the sky turned dark for 3 hours. And when he died, the curtain in the temple was torn, the veil from top to bottom. And Jesus cried out, my God, quoting from the Psalms, why have you forsaken me? Because in those moments of darkness, Jesus, who had never sinned, became sin for you and me. As our sin was placed upon him, he became sin for us, and he was suffering the punishment of our sin, spiritual suffering of Jesus. And so like yesterday, I did some reflecting and praying. And part of what I prayed about was for God to keep working in my life so that I will be more holy, and that my life will increasingly bring joy to Jesus and not sorrow. Because my Lord, your Lord, he's already suffered enough for us. Well, those are my thoughts. I hope you take some time to really have some thoughts about this yourself and draw closer to your Lord, who loves you so much. God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow.